right, here we go. So first of all, 1, 2, and 3, those are in your notes already, so you can go back and you can graph the inverse sine, cosine, and tangent yourself, okay? So I'm starting on the second part, and so this is the part, the inverse, tangent, and the sine and cosine. And this is where we restricted our values. And so what you have to have memorized for this part, and if you want to put it on your little yellow sheet, so the cosine got restricted from 0 to pi. So the sine and the tangent got restricted from negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. So in the sine and cosine, you're always going to have plus or minus your reference angle. You're going to have a positive, it's a positive value, and you're going to have a negative if it's a negative value. For the cosine, you're going to have your reference angle for positive, and for negative, you're going to have pi minus the reference angle. That's on your negative side. So, if we look at number 1, it's asking, where is the sine, the square root of 3 over 2? So the sine would be at pi over 3, right? And it's positive, so I'm using a positive pi over 3. Okay, here's the other thing you probably want to memorize. This is for tangent. Yes. Because it's a positive. Because we restricted to the first and fourth on sine and tangent. Anything with the inverse, that's why we wrote it down. These are, they're all restricted like this. All of these, every single one of them, when they have the negative one, the arc sine, the arc cosine, they're all restricted. But the green homework that you did, none of those were restricted. None of them had the inverse. It didn't have the little negative one, right? So those are not restricted. So the only thing that gets restricted are these. And these are the inverse ones. And these all have the negative one or their arc sine. And when they're written that way, they're all restricted. Okay? So I can only have the positive pi over 3 for this one. Okay, so where is the tangent, the square root of 3 over 3? At pi over 6. But I want a negative, so it's negative pi over 6. Because for the sine and the tangent, it's either positive or negative. That's your only choice. Yeah, just for fun. It really is negative pi over 6. That's the answer. So look, I know, I didn't just add it.
They thought you were serious.
I know. I was getting ready to finish off my explanation here, but y'all, where is the tangent negative? Is it positive or negative in the first quadrant? What is it in the fourth quadrant? So then it's a negative pi over 6. I didn't just add it, right? I made it negative pi over 6 because it's a negative value. So where is the sign -1? Okay, so 3 pi over 2, but is that in my restricted? It's got to be pi over 2 to negative pi over 2. So it's negative pi over 2. It has to be. It has to be on this side. What? Which one, Jada? Ask a question. One question. I know. But I think it's a good question. But so if this is the sign of a positive 1, what would the answer be? Positive pi over 2. Because it's negative, it's a negative pi over 2. It's either positive or minus the reference angle. That's your only choice for sine and tangent. All right, so now, tangent. It has to be a positive reference angle or a negative reference angle. So right away, I have a negative value. So what do I know my answer is going to be? Negative. And where is it the square root of 3? So it's a negative pi over 3. So where is the sign of positive 1/2? Pi over 6. It's positive, so it's a positive reference angle, pi over 6. So the inverse sign, so we know square root of 2 is pi over 4, right? Square root of 2 over 2 is pi over 4. But it's negative, so what's my answer? Yes. Okay, now, cosine gets restricted this way, right? It has to be here or here, in the first or the third. So this one, I want to know where is the cosine of negative square root of 3 over 2. So so listen before you answer, okay? So just tell me where is cosine square root of 3 over 2. So it's at pi over 6, right? That's correct. But that's a positive 1. I need negative. And what did I say I had to do to get over here? Pi minus pi over 6. So it's 5 pi over 6. Okay? So, on the next one, when I have the 2 of them, the first thing I'm going to ask myself is the negative 0.8, is that inside my restricted area? You can just cancel all of it out. Only if it's in the restricted area. So the first thing you have to ask, negative 0.8, is that in my sign? Yes. So I can just cancel, and the answer here is negative 0.8. How about 2? Is 2 in my restricted area? It's not. So this one doesn't exist. Because it's negative 1 to 1, right?
So 10 does not exist.
So, okay. So before you can say yes or no, cosecant, is that one of my unit circles? It's not. What is it the inverse for? Sine. What is the value? So the value becomes 1 over 4. That is between negative 1 and 1, so that's okay. So the sine of the inverse is 1 over 4. None. That yes. Tangent is negative infinity to positive infinity. Sine and cosine are the same on that, negative 1 to 1. We're going to finish these, honey. Okay, so when I get to number 11, is that one of my unit circle values? Really? 3/4. So this one we have to do the hypotenuse. So first quadrant, right? Where else could it be? Where? In the third, right? Because a negative divided by a negative is a positive. And if it doesn't tell you,
3, 4, 5.
It's a 3, 4, 5. So it's asking for the sign. What is the sign? It's y over r. And what is my y values? 3, positive or negative 3, right? Plus or minus 3 over 5. And so on a test, it'll tell you which quadrant, right? And yeah. So you had a 3, 4, 5 triangle. What was the other triangle that we had a lot of? 5, 12, 13. And so this one is 5, 12, 13. So this one says the y is negative 5 and the r is 13. So this is negative 5, but I could also have negative 5 over here. Yeah. So that makes this a plus or minus 12, right? The radius is always positive because you square it. So the cosine ends up being plus or minus. Yeah, that's fine. Okay. So again, this is one that I hope I get to cancel, but I have to look. Is 11 pi over 6 in my restricted area? Pi over 6 is how many degrees? 30 times 11 makes that 330. Is that in my restricted area? Cosine is restricted on top, right? So what is the cosine down here? Is it positive or negative? Cosine is the x. Positive. So which one do I want? I want the first quadrant, which is pi over 6. Probably. Okay, so here I have the inverse of the sine of negative pi over 4. It says negative pi over 4, is that in my restricted area for sine? It is, so this is negative pi over 4. Five pi over 6. Pi over 6 is 30 times 5 is 150, which puts me here. Is that in my restricted area for my tangent? It's not. What is the tangent here? Positive or negative? It's negative. Where is the tangent negative in the first or the fourth quadrant? Fourth. So I'm going to have a negative pi over 6. How many of you does that help? Yes. Yes. All right, turn it to the back. Okay, sine squared minus 1, using your handy-dandy little card that I just gave you. So I have sine squared of x plus cosine squared of x equals 1. I want it to be sine squared minus 1. So what happens to the cosine squared? It's negative. So if I have sine over cosecant, so right away, if it's sine and cosecant, if they're mixed, I want to make them all sine and cosine. So cosecant is what? 1 over sine. So if I have sine over 1 over sine, what do I have to do? Flip it, and so I get sine squared of x. Number 18. What do you think I'm going to do first? Since it's minus 1 and plus 1, I'm going to multiply right away because the middle terms cancel out. So I get secant squared of x minus 1. And so 1 plus tangent squared of x equals secant squared of x. So secant squared minus 1 equals these are easy. So the last one is 1 plus cotangent squared of x equals cosecant squared of x. Yes, negative 1. So what happens if you don't have these memorized? Like, there's nothing I can do. Like, I can stand up here and preach until, I don't know, an angel appears. And nothing is going to happen if you don't memorize this. Like, nothing. Okay. 1 minus sine squared. So 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared over cosine. So what happens? 1 cancel, and it just leaves me with the cosine of x. All right, everybody try 21. Make it all sine and cosine.
What happened to 22?
Okay, the correct answer is secant squared. All right, so there's a couple different ways to do this. So first of all, if I have, what is sine times cosecant? 1. So this is 1. Plus sine squared, and the secant is 1 over cosine squared. So what is sine squared over cosine squared? Tangent squared, and 1 plus tangent squared is so if you would have distributed, if I made this sine squared times 1 over sine squared, what happens with the sine squareds? And I still get 1. So no matter which way you do it, you end up with the same answer. How many of you got that? Sine squared times cosecant squared is 1. Sine times secant is 1 over cosine squared. Because you had to distribute it to both things. This times this and this times this. What did you do? Okay. So look. Bruno, you get the same thing. You can't add it. No, you can't.
See, that's what I did, right?
Okay, so look. So if you do this, then if I take this times this, what happens to the sine squareds? So I get 1. If I take this times this, I get sine squared over cosine squared, which is tangent squared. 1 plus tangent squared is secant
I
squared.
don't know how you got that.
So it doesn't matter which order you do it in. You'll all end up, what?
You didn't really have to put the 1 over cos, right?
Yeah, you do. Because that's the secant. That's how you get the tangent.
And then you get the tangent, you get secant. Like, nah. Wow, so you didn't have to do it, right? You could have just put 1 over sin and then cancel that out. And then you still would end up with just secant. I see what you're saying. I see what you're saying.
This one?
The front. Because you know she writes in pen, so she scribbles right.
All right.
No.
Okay, so what am I going to do with 28?
You gonna
Okay, so we're going to multiply, right?
yeah.
So 1 times secant is secant.
What the?
1 times tangent, tangent.
Oh, I'm on the wrong problem.
Minus sine times secant is minus, then minus sine of x tangent of x. Okay, so I wrote all that out.
And we gonna cancel half of it.
Yes, we are. But to do that, what do I have to do? You have to make it all into sine and cosine. Because I said. What? So 1 over cosine. Secant of x is 1 over the cosine. So tangent, sine over cosine. Then I have sine. I'm going to leave that. But the secant is 1 over the cosine. So can I just write sine over cosine? Is that okay with everybody?
Wait, what?
That's what's going to happen. Look, the secant is 1 over the cosine. So that's really sine over cosine. Okay, sine. So the tangent is sine over cosine. Sine squared x over cosine. So what cancels? So this and this cancel. Okay. Okay. So everybody listen carefully. So I have 1 over cosine minus sine squared over cosine. So I'm going to factor out a 1 over cosine. And that leaves me with 1 minus sine squared of x. What is 1 minus sine squared? Cosine squared, which cancels with one of the cosines. So it's cosine. I didn't. What? 1 minus sine squared is cosine squared.
Wait, go back through the whole thing.
Okay. So what did I do? The first thing I did, I multiplied. Number 2, I changed it all to sine and cosine so stuff would cancel out. And then I saw that I had cosine on the bottom, both on the bottom, so I factored out the 1 over cosine, And that leaves me with 1 minus sine squared, which is cosine squared. And one of them canceled then. Okay, 29 is easy peasy. What is sine over cosine? Tangent. We all better get that one. What do you want me to make it? I'll fix it tomorrow. We'll have the sine of Isaac over the cosine of Isaac. So, what am I going to do here? Okay, before I do that, the first thing I'm going to do, 1 minus sine squared is what? Cosine squared. And what is secant? So what happens to them? And it leaves you with? Okay. You're all here. I want you all to look at number 33. Yes.
You said 33?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's awesome.
Okay. So, listen. Shh. So, the sine squared minus cosine squared, I'm just going to leave that to start with. But on the bottom, sine to the fourth of x minus cosine to the fourth of x, that'll factor, correct? So, I'm going to have sine squared of x minus cosine squared of x. Okay, I'm going to explain that in just a second, Cardarius. You're correct, you can. Okay, so what Cardarius is saying is, yes, this factors, right, to sine plus sine of x plus cosine of x times.
What I factor was you take out the sine squared x, and I made it a negative, and then the bottom is positive, right?
No. Okay, so here's what happens. So these two do factor. They do. The reason I didn't factor them is because I know these are going to cancel. I can see they're going to cancel, right? So instead of doing all the extra factoring, I'm just going to cancel these to start with. And that leaves me 1 over 1, which is 1. All right. So I still have cotangent of x.
I did not see none of that. You should have put that a little bit more closer.
So you have the cosine over the sine times the sine over the cosine. What happens with these? And what does that leave you with?
I was still right.
So it's 1 plus 1, which is 2.
I was wrong.